Okay, so thank you for the intro. And so if this presentation doesn't go anywhere in the direction that you guys want, I can blame the red eye, I guess. But so I'm Lama Nachman. I am a principal engineer in Intel Research. And I have been essentially working on some form of sensing and sense-making for the last 10 years, mainly over the last 5 years focused on context awareness. And I come from a group called Interaction and Experience Research in Intel Labs. It's led by Dr. Genevieve Bell, if you guys are aware of her. And basically, it's a group that's made up of social scientists, anthropologists, designers, interaction designers, human factor engineers, and a lot of computer scientists working on specific research areas. And in my case, my research area happens to be context awareness. So in terms of motivation for this work, so I have been quite frustrated by the notion of calling phones smart. And I don't know how many of you feel that way, but I am frankly fascinated by the fact that after owning devices for such a long time, they don't know anything about us more than they have the day we bought them. And if you're like me and you end up taking your mobile phone to all the different places that I do, and some places where no other person ever goes to, you would think that it should actually know a bit more. And I remember a time when we actually had to enter all of our contacts and everything from one phone to another. And we were so amazed by the notion that now, when I get a new phone, I can sync it from the cloud, and it will know my contacts, even though I actually entered my contacts to begin with. So that knowledge we're quite fascinated by. So that kind of, we started thinking about what does it mean for these devices to become smart? So if you start to think about, well, does it have a capability to observe? And as it observes and understands, can it start to act? And the problem with action is it all brings back a vision of Clippy, which I guess nobody wants. So then you start thinking about, OK, well, the theory is that if it understood more about the context, hopefully those actions will be a bit more appropriate. And that's really the motivation of the work of context awareness. So, clearly, there are multiple instances of some form of context that has shown up in devices, and I'm just mentioning a few here. But I still remember when the iPhone came out, and you would flip the screen, and it was just flip the orientation, and people were just amazed by that fact. And they were amazed by that fact, I think, not because it seems like a very reasonable thing to do, but it's because it was able to autonomously figure this out and then do a reasonable action, right? Or, for example, when you brought the phone next to your ear and it disabled the touch screen, it just assumed that you really were not planning to dial with your ear, which seemed like a reasonable conclusion, right? Or, for example, with many of the location capabilities, right? If you go to Google and Google Maps and you're trying to actually figure out where you're going, assuming that you're going to pre-populate with where you are right now, which is not necessarily a valid assumption all the time, but a valid assumption most of the time. So these were like very simple, basic actions that made the user experience a little bit better and exploited the notion of autonomous understanding and action. So if you think about context awareness, right, there are kind of a couple of ways of looking at it from a scope perspective, right? There is the scope of awareness. So early on, say 10 years ago, it was really so much about the context of the device, right? Where we started to see sensing and action, for example, right? When accelerometers were embedded in hard drives, right? They were embedded in hard drives because they were trying to do something very specific. If I dropped my laptop, it needed to know that it was getting dropped, park the hard disk so that it doesn't get damaged in the process of falling. So these type of things kind of materialize very early on. And then now we're kind of in the scope of what I call the me, right? So it's starting to go beyond device context to my context, starting to infer some things about me, maybe the fact that, how many steps have I taken or something like that, which is not necessarily about how I'm interacting with the device, but a bit more about my own context. And as you start to think about how that, goes further from, the social aspect of it and how it aggregates across the world, that kind of talks about the first vector, which is the scope of awareness. The second vector, which is interesting to think about, is the scope of action, right? So at one level of that spectrum, there's a notion of what it's aware of, it's making you aware of, right? It's enhancing your own awareness by what it's understanding. And the most basic examples here is, for example, Fitbit, right? I mean, if you start to understand more about your physical activity, number of steps you've taken, et cetera, it's actually giving you an understanding that, you would argue, why would you need this understanding? Because we're really very bad at having an accurate reflection of ourselves. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done, but that's definitely very true. But the other side of it is that it's a safer thing to do, right? Because if you miscalculate, and all of these algorithms have some form of error associated with them, but if you miscalculate, okay, maybe you took actually 2,000 steps and it told you 2,100. I mean, that's not a huge problem, right? But then if you start to think where that would go, there is a whole end of the spectrum that has to do with a lot of proactive action, right? This is like, I'm going to miss my flight. I'm here. There's no way I'm going to make it to the airport. I sure hope that's not true. But, then it might just completely rebook my flights, right? And, that, I think, is going to be a very hard problem because even United can't do that with people. So, I mean, I'm not very helpful in that example. But, so context awareness has been around for a very long time. And clearly, from a research standpoint, in academic papers, a lot of industry labs, et cetera, we've been talking about this for decades. The question is, why are we so excited about it now, right? Why are we so serious about doing all of this work? And that's not just Intel. I mean, you'll see that in many of the academic institutions, as well as many of the industrial research labs. So I think we're actually at this point where many things are coming together at the same time, right? So if you look at the notion of ubiquitous sensing, I mean, today it's really very hard to buy a phone or even a tablet that doesn't have a lot of sensors embedded in it, right? So the notion of ubiquity of sensing is actually happening. And I just, I kind of just drew this, and I don't even have the iPhone 5 here, but I just drew this to kind of show, this rapid increase of sensors, and they continue to increase, right? And now we have a lot of wearable sensors that are going on the body and so on and so forth. So that's clearly happening, right? The other side of it is that the computation in your pocket is increasing, right? And it's increasing at a power-efficient level. And yes, we're all frustrated by the lifetime of these devices, but it is actually, I mean, if you think about a phone that lasts at least on a single charge, or sometimes two, throughout the day, that's actually, with that amount of compute, you start to actually do something really reasonable with all of that raw sensor data, right? You can start to analyze and process this information in very interesting ways. The third part of this is connectivity, right? Always connected. And again, we have a lot of our frustration about connectivity, but to a large extent, that's true today, right? So not only does it observe from your surrounding, but it can get observations from all over the world, and it can start to bring information that's actually relevant or act based on that information in relevant ways. So if you start to think about all of these different factors, it's really getting to the point where we can start to do things that are extremely interesting and promising along those lines. So I'm going to mention a few examples, and let me just ask a question. How many of you are familiar with how do we extract context out of data? OK, so let me say something about that, because what I've noticed is a lot of times when I talk about this, people think it's science fiction, and it really isn't. And so I just want to kind of give a glimpse of what do we mean and how do we go about it. So I'll give a few examples of some pieces of context that we can figure out today. So for example, we have this notion. So I talked about all of these sensors. And when you think about sensors, I use the word sensors loosely. And some of those are hard sensors, which we think of as transducers. They measure some sort of a physical phenomenon. They translate it to something. An accelerometer is one example of that, right? But there are also these, what we call soft sensors, right? So these are any type of software that's running on some device that's extracting some useful information. So if you think about, for example, something that runs and monitors what specific applications you're running or what websites you're visiting, right? So it understands that you're presenting something, or it understands that you're shopping on the web or something like that, right? So that starts to give you a lot of information. about people's activities. So if you think about all of these different sensors, there is this notion of kind of a first level of understanding, right? So I can look at an accelerometer, and from that data, I can tell if somebody happens to be walking or running or how many steps they've taken, et cetera. I can look at audio signals, and not only, speech recognition has been around for a long time, but I can start to tell things like, I can hear speech in the background, or I can hear music in the background, or the noise is pretty high, or I believe this person is speaking. All of these things you can start to extract from the audio signals, right? You could also, get a lot of information clearly from the camera, who's in front of the device, what types of objects, et cetera. And you can also get a lot of information from location, which I guess we all know. Now, if you take all of this first level understanding and then marry it with a lot of the information that I was talking about from the soft sensing, and fuse that at a higher level from an algorithmic perspective, you can start to figure out things like, what high-level activities people are doing, right? I'm here presenting at this specific conference. I'm hanging out with my friends at Starbucks, whatever it might be. So that's one example, which is, what type of activities people are doing. Another example, which, I'll touch on this later, actually, in the presentation as well. But, we believe that understanding who you're with is a very core piece to bringing in very compelling experiences, right? And I'll mention examples of why that's the case. But in terms of how do we figure this out, right? If you think about devices as being proxies to people, right? I have my device, you have your device, our devices, we come together, our devices come together, we can start to understand now that we're together. Now, some of that is based on going from like wireless information to distance measurements, which is a byproduct of those wireless signals. But also, one of the things that we've realized very quickly is that distance isn't necessarily a very good measure of social distance. And by social distance, I mean that we're really within, a conversational distance. Let's put it that way, right? So, however, this is one of the reasons why we started kind of bringing in audio into this equation. Because if I think about, not only that we're proximate in distance, but that our devices happen to hear something similar, right? They don't know what they're hearing, but they're hearing something similar. That says something about us being within an earshot of each other, right? And then if you start, and which makes a huge difference. So for example, in this room, right, I am in the same conversational distance as the person at the end of this room, right? But if I happen to be across a wall or at the cafe at lunch with all this noise, those are really very different conversations at the same distance. So that's why that becomes really much more relevant. But then, it's not only the physical distance part, there's also the virtual distance, right? If I happen to be on a call with you, then I'm really quite connected with you at this point in time. So, so we take all of these things into consideration. Finally, emotions, right? So I think this is one of the things that people can see gazillion advantages of figuring this out. And I think it's one of the hardest problems. And I think it's one of the hardest problems not just because it's hard to get signals that express emotions. And there are many signals that we measure today that do correlate with emotions. But I think it's because typically all of these contextual algorithms, the way they get developed is that you get a lot of data. You annotate it with some notion of ground truth. And I think ground truthing emotion is one of the hardest things ever. So, and this is something that we've seen over and over again. We would, we'd do all of these experiments. We'll put all of these different devices on people. We'll collect all of this data. But then we need to annotate it with something. Are you sad? Are you happy? Are you positive? Whatever, right? And you start asking people this question. And one of the things that we found out very quickly is that you could look through what somebody is describing about their day, and it sounds terrible, right? I mean, they just missed this, and they, their presentation sucked, and they got scolded by their boss and whatever. And then you ask them, was this a positive day or a negative day? And they'll go, oh, it was very positive, right? And there is this notion of the way we think of ourselves and how we portray ourselves that really, from an emotion standpoint, right, which, if somebody's walking or running, that's much easier to tell. So, but from an emotional standpoint, right, there are a lot of signals, be it your heart rate or your galvanic skin response or audio that gives a lot of indication of your emotional state. And, while physiology correlates with emotion, unfortunately, it correlates with many other things. So if I just now started walking, my heart rate is going to go up, right? And that's not because I just had an emotional meltdown. It's because I started walking. Now, it's possible that I had an emotional meltdown and started running because of it. But it becomes really hard to actually start to tease these things apart. And as a result, bringing in much more of that context, right, starts to, if I understood that you happen to be walking, for example, then I can take that into the equation and figure out that your emotion isn't correlating necessarily with your physiology. So in general, if you look at all of these different algorithms, essentially that's how it kind of works, right? This is what's really under the hood, right? And next, I'm just going to put all of these equations up there, and no. But this is as far as I'm going to get on that note. So you have some notion of a sensor. You get some features extracted out of that sensor. You apply some form of a classification algorithm, and then you output something like the user is running, or there's music in the background, or whatever it might be. That's how we go about figuring those things out. So that's all great in terms of starting to understand your context in the moment, right? But really, if you think about from a potential standpoint for people who develop experiences in this space, it's really important to start to understand context over a long period of time, right? Because what you're really trying to understand is all of these different patterns that are emerging, and what are you going to do about it, right? So, for example, right? I mean, let's take traffic as an example, right? So if I'm driving, I actually live in San Francisco. I work in Santa Clara, right? That's about an hour commute if I'm driving, right? And whenever I drive, I hit traffic in exactly the same spot every single day. And if my device told me about the thing that I know about every single day, I would probably throw it out of the window, right? But if you think about it deciding to tell me something that it thinks I don't know because I have not observed it, because it hasn't observed it, right? That becomes more interesting. If it tells me about the traffic jam that I've never hit, right, in the spot that I didn't hit, that becomes important. So this is why trying to understand trends over time becomes much more relevant. And beyond time, if you think about devices, right, so different devices observe different aspects of us, right? I mean, my laptop is in places usually very different from where my tablet is, right? And as these devices come together and exchange that notion, and not only merge this information, but also understand the context of use, right? It needs to also understand how it's being used differently from what the tablet is being used, right? Because all of this is actually useful in terms of how you're going to then act on this information. And then, as I said initially in the beginning slide when I was talking about the scope of awareness, it becomes really interesting to then start to think about how does that aggregate across the world, right? So there are many examples today where we're seeing this data providing a very different perspective once it aggregates over the world. And I don't know how, are you guys familiar with Patch Bay, what used to be Patch Bay, which is COSM today? Are you guys familiar with that? Okay, so the most, so there was, it's basically a site that allows you to upload all sorts of different sensor data, and then you can create visualizations on top of it and hook different sensors. And originally, a lot of people did that for the purpose of trying to understand energy use in the home. But what was really interesting, and its claim to fame, was when the Japan disaster happened. Right? And when the Japan disaster happened, what was interesting was that people were struggling with getting information from the government to try to understand where the exposure is for the radiation. So what people ended up doing is they went out, they bought radiation meters, they connected it to COSM, and they uploaded all of this data. And then you had all of these people doing all sorts of interesting visualizations and analytics on top of that data, right? And very quickly, you got a very good view at a very high density, much more than the government could do, where it clearly identified where the exposure areas were. But in a sense, I mean, this is, if you think about traffic and Waze and, all of these different examples, it's actually really interesting as you start to kind of aggregate this information that's crowdsourced. So, OK, so that's great. So those are examples. Now, in terms of what are the type of things that we think we can tell? And honestly, all of these examples that I have in there are areas of active research. So it's not like we're imagining this is going to happen. At some form or another, we are able to do this at varying levels of accuracy, right? So be it things like where the phone happens to be on me, is it in my pocket, is it in my bag, what type of physical activity I'm doing, what type of sentiment can I extract from specific posts, what's my emotional state, what kind of a high-level activity I'm doing, what am I interested in, I happen to be with, biometric identification from things like audio, video, gait. The way I walk is very specific to me, and I can get a lot of information from that. So and those are just examples. I mean, there are many more examples that we and others are working on. But those are the type of things that you can start to imagine become a piece of knowledge that many of the developers will have access to. And you guys as designers, as developers, et cetera, you need to start to think about, well, how do I start to create very compelling experiences based on all of this knowledge that's going to come in? So what I figured I'll do is I figured it will probably be useful to mention a few examples or motivating examples that we decided to go build to say, so what, right? I know all of this context. What can I do with it? And when we ended up coming up with these examples, I mean, context, in so many ways, is probably one of the most ambiguous things, right? Because context can be anything and everything. And when we started this research, back in 2007, we were thinking, well, what context is relevant? What do we really mean by context, right? So what we ended up doing is we said, OK, well, if I want to think about all of these different algorithms and interesting things that I can find out, let me think about what are all the interesting experiences that can be created that are contextually aware, and then look for common elements across them. And those, to a certain level, would help point to some of those contextual elements that would be extremely useful to go after, right? So, some of those things we ended up building as prototypes. Some of those we just had as, thought processes that helped us. But let me walk you through a few. So the first thing is what I call context-aware communication. So one of the problems, I would argue today, with phones, which, if you think about being, let's say you're going to drop by somebody's cube or by somebody's office or home or whatever to talk to them. There's a lot of cues that you get from there about whether somebody's busy or they're tired or whatever, right? That you essentially lose completely when you call somebody. And in fact, a lot of people end up texting and doing a lot of that stuff because to a certain level, calling somebody seems to be like you're imposing, right, in some way. You're assuming that you're important enough that they're going to pick up the call. And of course, when people used to tell me this, I would go, well, you don't have to pick up the call. But it is true. Like some people feel, there's a whole social obligation, whatever, that people feel like they need to pick up the phone. And of course, then you have other people who continue to call you until you pick up the phone, which even is worse. But if you think about that, right? So we started thinking, OK, what if we can bring back the context into communication, right? So I'm calling you, but what if I picked up the phone and I went to call you, and I got a glimpse of your context, right? My husband has the tendency to call me to just say hi. And a lot of times, we will have this conversation. My phone would ring. I would see that the call is from him. I would never know it's an emergency or it's not an emergency. I will step out of a meeting. I will pick up the call. What's up? He's like, no, I just wanted to say hi. I'm like, I just stepped out of a meeting because you wanted to say hi. And, and then, you can start to do all of these assumptions about, well, if you call me twice, then I'll come out, and all of these things. But, honestly, at the end of the day, giving some context to him would have probably been very useful. If he knew I was in a meeting and he decided to call me to tell me hi, then he'll have other problems, right? So at that, at that level, you could see how some of that context is actually useful. But also, if you think about it on the other end, right? So if I am in a meeting and my device is able to understand a little bit about my context and the context of the call and do something a bit intelligent, be it even surface some message through the specific device that I happen to look at or the inconspicuous way of showing this to me, right? If I happen to be using my laptop, it's probably a message there wouldn't be as obvious as a message on my phone. If I'm driving something that's audio that isn't, requiring me to do this, which I do all the time when I'm driving. So a lot of these basic notions of common sense, right, start to become possible with this. So that's the first example. A second example is, in some way, starting to enable introspection, right? And this is a topic that's dear to my heart, right? And I would say the best example that I can think of, right? Because when we started this work, and I would mention this example, people will tell me, well, why would somebody need to know what they're doing? I mean, they know what they're doing. Why do they need their device to tell them what they're doing? And I was always fascinated by this, right? Because the parallel that's obvious is finances, right? How many of you are shocked by your American Express statement at the end of the year? And please don't don't convince me that you guys aren't, or unless I'm really very bad at it. But it's, the thing that's very true in people is that while we're so aware of every single microtransaction that we make, we're very bad at understanding holistically the impact that has on our life, right? And maybe I should know that I spend a lot of money on wine, but every year it's like, I can't believe I spent that much money on wine. But and maybe that's denial and not really lack of ability to understand. But no matter how you think about it, when things aggregate at a high level, it's really, people are very bad at understanding this. And we've seen many, many examples from health, fitness, et cetera, that prove the same thing. So then we started thinking about, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we did the same thing that we do for financing to time, right? Wouldn't it be great if I understood, how am I spending my time? Who am I spending it with? How am I feeling about these things, right? Then you start to think about all of these possibilities along the same line. A third example, and this is actually something that we deployed back in, I think it was a few years back, in India. So India is known as the diabetes capital of the world. And we did this collaboration with Manipal University, with a physician at Manipal University who was working with a lot of pre-diabetics. And the assumption there, so when we asked him about some of the challenges that he had, with pre-diabetes, really exercise and food are two ways of really kind of reversing that trend. And the problem is, usually he meets with his patients, quite often. And usually the conversation goes like this. Well, how often are you exercising? Oh, I'm exercising a lot. I'm very busy. I'm doing stuff. OK, great. So then they're starting to figure out, how do you actually increase the exercise, given that they seem to be exercising all the time? That doesn't seem to be a very possible thing, right? So then we said, OK, well, what if we built something that actually collected all of this exercise information? So at the time, this is like pre-Fitbit, right? So it collected this information, and it calculated that as some sort of calorie expenditure. But it also allowed you to enter very easily from an Indian context, right, what you're eating. And then it will automatically calculate these things. And not only is it going to show you what your goal is and how you're trending towards that goal on a daily basis, but it will also share that information with the physician so that when you're sitting with the physician, you guys have data that you can start to talk about. And we deployed it. And then after all this work on all of these algorithms to understand what people are doing and what calories they're burning, we deploy it, and we get back exactly the same message from all of the participants. We had about 5 participants for 8 weeks. 15 participants, I'm sorry, for 8 weeks. And the message was, it is inaccurate. It is not measuring physical activity correctly. And we're like, yeah, that could be the case in India. What did we screw up, right? So we went there. And we started to, evaluate this. And funny enough, the device was actually accurate. So then, luckily, when we were thinking about this, we thought, OK, it would be useful to not only calculate calories, but to also tell people what it is that they're doing in case they wanted to validate it. So then we started showing people, right, OK, now do this, and then they would look, and now do that, and then they would look. And they realized that actually it was quite accurate. So then came the realization, oh my God, we're very sedentary, right? And that's really shocking at some level, because you would think that you would be aware of your physical activity. But what I realized is that, if you go and ask somebody who's sitting in front of a couch watching TV all day, are you sedentary? They're going to say yes, right? But if you think about somebody who's very busy, right, who's working day in and day out, they're very busy. And they think of themselves as very busy, and as a result, very active. But if you think about most of the jobs that we do today, those jobs are very sedentary. And I would argue the more busy you are, the less physically active you tend to be in these type of jobs. But the problem is it doesn't create that awareness, right? So again, another example where that awareness started to help. And actually, we've seen, when people started to realize this, then we've seen actually a trend where that actually has changed within actually even just the 8 weeks of that experiment. Another quick example that I would mention is, we also started thinking about, what about gaming, right? I mean, can we start to use context as currency in games, right? And that was just kind of like, can we play with context, really? And we created all of these different series of games that use context as things that were automatically measured, and it will give you all of these different things to go do as a 007, and it will measure how well you're doing them and things like that. Let me skip over this for the sake of time. This, I think, is much more relevant. I was listening to the panel before my presentation. And there was a lot of focus on personalization. And if you think about it, right, I mean, today, we have so much info that's thrown at us, right? And that info, in so many ways, I just talked about all of these examples where you can start to understand people at a certain level and really create things that are much more relevant to them, right? But we started looking at this problem of context, content consumption, and we did some tablet prototype. But we were thinking about, is it really sufficient for people to describe what they're interested in, right? Would that be sufficient to actually start to tailor that experience? And we started realizing, we pretty much realized 3 things that I would argue point towards you really need something that's not manually configured, right? So the first one is, typically, content consumption is very contextual in nature, right? The things that I do in the morning versus at night, versus at work, versus at home, versus when I happen to be with my son, versus by myself, all of this information, right, affects very much my content consumption. And the notion that I'm going to be able to describe my interest contextually to a device seems daunting, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, our interests do change over time. And there is a seasonal notion to our interests as well, right? So again, having to describe that over time is actually not that easy. But a third thing, which we also saw not only in content consumption, but in many other things, is this the same point that I was talking about with the perception, right? We have aspirations, and we do things most of the time that are not necessarily well aligned with our aspirations. From eating the salad versus the cake, from reading the junk versus what's considered something that's really intriguing and whatever, right? So it's like there are all of these assumptions and value judgments that we have in our heads, and we have this view of ourselves that whenever we're asked to give our interest, we tend to go with what we think of ourselves as opposed to what we actually do. So then if you start to think about all of these 3 examples, right, and you think about what I had mentioned originally, which is, we can start to understand what type of content you consume in what settings, and we can start to understand, how does that actually change over time, and are there specific patterns that are emerging? Are there seasonal patterns? Are there patterns of context that has to do with content that has to do with who you happen to be with? The final one that I would mention is, what I'm kind of calling the me versus we, right? So, if you remember in the beginning, I said in my opinion, one of the really important things to understand is who you happen to be with. And the reason for that, other than there are things from a privacy perspective and things that you might want to surface and not surface and all of that will play into this. But it's also about realizing that people's behavior is very, very different when they are by themselves versus with specific people, with other people, et cetera. So, if you think today about the notion of, let's take the example of a restaurant recommendation, something very simple, right? Today, there is this notion in the recommendation systems and in the recommendation world where it says, OK, well, we understand, we're going to observe your behavior over time, understand what affinities you have. I like to go to high-end restaurants. That's what it's going to go suggest for me. Great. Then, what happens when I am with somebody else, right? So then, a lot of work has, really started in this space to try to understand that. And typically, what this work has focused on is looking for the intersection of these different profiles of people. And I would argue that this is something that we found out from data, but the problem is that's really very simplistic, right? I mean, if you think about how I behave and how you behave and we come together, It's not that, okay, then 50% of the time I'm going to go to what I like or versus what you like, or it's the places that we both like. I mean, that's not how people behave in groups. And so what we did is we analyzed large data sets coming from Gala and Foursquare, et cetera, and we were trying to answer that simple question, which is, if I took all of the personal profiles, what I've generated from watching people, and I observed their group behavior, could I have predicted that based on the personal profiles? And the answer for many of the people was no. These people as groups looked very different than any form of aggregation of their individual profiles. And then, so the question is then, if you start to understand automatically who you happen to be with, then you can start to understand the identity of the group as a group, and not just as the sum of its parts, right? And more interestingly, then, of course, then people always ask me the question of, and then what do you do, right? I mean, do you just like now start to recommend to the group? Well, that's a completely different question, right? Because then I could start to become, you know, it depends on what it is that I'm trying to do, right? If I'm trying to create tension and challenge, maybe I'm going to start to voice the voices that are not heard, right? Maybe the person who is always dominated and never suggests, maybe that's what I'm going to start to amplify. I mean, you could do whatever you want to do, but the point is you really need to understand that context, and it's very hard to do it without understanding that context. So finally, you know, one of the interesting things about context is that you really have to look at it from a multidisciplinary perspective, right? And you know, there's a lot of user research that needs to be done to start to understand, well, you know, for example, you know, I put up that example that showed, you know, what context my friends are doing, right? What is okay to surface, right? What would people be comfortable surfacing? And, you know, in many cases today, what we end up sharing to the world, right, be it on Facebook or whatever it might be, is a very highly curated notion of us, right? So now as you start to say, well, some of these things are happening automatically, what is okay, right? That's a whole user research problem that needs to happen, right? Of course, I will, and I'm going to hold this up because I know I will probably get a question, but if there is time for a question. But I always get the question of what about privacy, right? And that's a whole, I mean, this is like at every level within this, there's things that we can do to enable, you know, logical things to do with privacy, right? From algorithmically to, you know, how do you actually configure these things? Because, yeah, while Facebook gives you, or actually even like the phone, right? Every single time you install an app, it will ask you, is it okay for this app to use your location? Now, multiply this by 100 contextual elements or 1,000 contextual elements, and by all the applications, clearly that's not a scalable solution, right? So that's one aspect of the problem. However, the thing that's really resonates a lot with me is from a design perspective, right? If you think about it, these algorithms are not very accurate, right? And by not very accurate, you know, I mean, even 90% accuracy isn't a really high accuracy, but some of those are even much less. I mean, when we get in this world to the 90%, we're going, whoo, this is fantastic, right? But if you think about it, that's 10% of the time it's not accurate. The problem is, you know, the way these things become more accurate is by having more data. And the only way you can have more data is by deploying these things. So it's like kind of a vicious cycle, right? But in my opinion, the problem with these things isn't the fact that we can't deploy until we get to the 100% accuracy. It's how do you start to design systems that understand the notion of inaccuracy, right? And I think one of the best examples that we have today is speech recognition, right? 5 years ago, I mean, speech recognition has always been 10 years out whenever you ask anybody. For the last 20 years of my life, then speech recognition has been 10 years out, right? But if you think about it, 5 years ago versus today, I would argue there has been a huge difference in adoption in back-end systems. I mean, it's very hard today to call any service and you don't get, you know, a voice recognition system, right? And 5 years ago, it sucked. Today, it's actually pretty reasonable. What is the difference, right? The difference isn't that we just pushed the barrier of what is possible from an accuracy standpoint. The difference is these systems started to comprehend that for 90% of the time, this thing might work. But for when it doesn't work, the notion that you had to actually go, hang up, call back again to get into the I mean, it's a commitment that you've made the minute you went into speech recognition, right? And now it's so easy. You can speak, you can touch, you can do whatever, I mean, you can type. So if I'm in the car, I might want to speak 3 or 4 times because stopping and typing is something that I don't want to do, right? But things that are that simple, that start to comprehend the fact that these signals are not 100% accurate, and you take that into the, you know, the core of the design of that experience, makes these things usable at that level of accuracy. The other thing that's really important is understanding feedback, right? Because, you know, these systems, as you start to personalize, you really need to get a lot of feedback from the user. And the problem with feedback, again, is, you know, how many people are going to go and do the rating of 3 and 5? And I mean, one of the reasons why we went to thumbs up and thumbs down was because people realized that people are not going to go and put all of this information. In fact, frankly, it's junk in between anyway, right? So then the notion that you start to somehow design into the experience things that you can infer user feedback from without necessarily maybe explicitly having to get it, but if you start to comprehend that you need to get a notion that people liked it or didn't like it and somehow design that experience to easily glean that information, helps drastically, right? And you know, the notion of transparency as well, right? Because as these devices start to actuate on their own, they're going to start to wonder, right? Why the hell did you surface what you just surfaced? That doesn't look anything like me, right? But if I were able to get a sense of the logic underneath why something happened, and I went, oh, okay, well, I understand that, right? This is the same example of why does Amazon continue to give me suggestions of things that, you know, my son likes, right? Or the one thing that I bought once for somebody. It's that sort of a knowledge, right? How do you start to surface this view that the device has of you and help you to tweak it if you wanted to tweak it, but more importantly to understand so that you can start to create the trust between, you know, the device and the person. And finally, you know, I talked a lot about the technology and what, you know, what we need to do from an accuracy enhancement perspective as well as trying to start to understand the groups. So I will basically just summarize that really, you know, if you think for all the reasons that I have mentioned, you know, context awareness is really a capability that has the ability to absolutely transform that relationship between people and devices. And it really takes a huge UX community to actually bring it to reality. So I hope that that, you know, at some level resonates with you guys and you're going to all start working on context-aware experiences. So I guess I have 2 minutes. So I don't know if you guys want to do questions, or I know you're right on time. But
we have, I guess, 2 minutes. Anybody got a quick question? We can ask it. What questions do you have? Ideas, context. Anybody struggle with context in their development or design? Maybe context of a wedding? Yes? Any questions come to mind? Anyone? Anyone? Okay.
Wow,
Let's thank you. Thank you very much.